Welcome back to the Change Physician podcast. I am Melissa Cady with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and we are joined by our amazing returning, I don't know how many returning guests, Eric Tait. Yes, Dr. Eric Tait. And we had a little conversation before this episode, and we're talking about some things that sometimes can be quite frustrating for we as physicians, realizing that despite our extensive education, that we can be in a room and feel like we don't have the control, or at least having the environment running the way we'd like it to be. And so then we started talking about something that's going to be happening in future episodes anyway, is this personal development aspect and how this all ties together. And so I would love to you started talking about, I think it's good for people to hear a little bit about what you had said, and that how, as much as physicians think that things should be running the way they are because of us being in the room, that's not quite the reality. Do you mind just kind of giving people a little reminder, as much as it can be frustrating, what the reality is of us as physicians in the medical world?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. Not a problem. And so it's a big thing if you ever see any of my writing or any of the groups that I'm in and talking about kind of the healthcare system in general. And just from a bona fide standpoint, my MBA is in healthcare management and entrepreneurship, right? So I literally have studied healthcare management from the early 2000s when a lot of these things were going in. I've actually have published research around some of these things, around managed care. And so, I have a specific expertise in this. And I could give a soliloquy about all this, but ultimately what it boils down to in our system, it is essentially the payment model determines the delivery model. Okay. That's what it ultimately boils down to. So our healthcare delivery model is completely based upon essentially who's paying for the checks and who's writing the checks and who's paying for things. And so from that standpoint, if you understand that that is the case, nothing's going to change kind of in the day-to-day environment unless you change the payment model, right? So we talk about DPC, direct primary care. Those docs love it. If they can get enough patients into their practice, they love it because they're their own boss. Because why? Their actual customers pay them, right? Not a third party. Right. And so if a third party is paying you, a third party dictates to you what needs to be done, whether they have a medical degree or not. And what I always say is it's the expectations and reality mismatch in the world is what causes stress and anxiety and burnout, right? In the medical world, there's an expectation that because we went to school, we're almost always the most educated and technically, quote unquote, the smartest people in the room, and that nothing ever happens without us, right? But we control nothing, right? We have no real agency in the system. Right. And that creates a lot of cognitive dissonance and a lot of discord internally. Right. We have all the liability, we're all these other things, but all these people are coming at us and taking away from us. And it sucks. Mm-hmm. There's no two ways about it. But unless you're going to retire or go cash, there's no way to change that reality. And so that reality is what it is. And the only way you change reality, and back to the personal development situation, if we go to Stephen Covey, right, mm-hmm. you have to enlarge your circle of influence. Right? You can rail as you want. You can tilt at all the windmills that you want and be Don Quixote. But unless you have enough people behind you, change is not going to occur just because you don't like the way something is. And so if physicians can begin to reframe and understand where we are, right? There's some people who are working on trying to create physician unions and all of that. And there's some questions around the legalities and all of that, right? Cool. They're doing something to try to increase their sphere of influence, to try and change either public perception or what have you, right? So it's actually a productive use of energy and time. The non-productive use of energy and time is screaming in the physician's lounge, is screaming on Facebook groups about how all these things are unfair, right? Because all that screaming, you're not going to change anything, right? The flip side of it is we have literally 0% unemployment unless you don't want to work, right? You can always do some locum somewhere in your profession and always get paid. There's no other profession that has that kind of job security, right? People would beg for our job security. So if you just take it out of who we think we are and who we think we should be based upon our education and all of the things that we have done, and I'm not saying that we did not sacrifice, but understand we still live in a relatively privileged position as kind of labor beings, right? Because essentially the payment model has commodified what we do. We are now just a cog in a larger machine. unless you're, again, own your own practice and you're doing cash pay and things of that nature. And so the reframing and reshifting and understanding that, you know what, medicine is what I do, medicine is not who I am. And if we can begin to de-link and depersonalize our ego from the practice of medicine and what we think it should be, now I'm talking outside of patient care and patient safety, right? That's a different ballgame. Sometimes some swords you have to die on if there's an unsafe situation that's happening, right? But most of the stuff is not unsafe. It's just you don't like it, or there's coverage decisions being made that you don't like, right? That's sometimes a choice on the part of the patient in terms of what kind of insurance they have and things of that nature. That's not something that we have controlled, right? Patients have decided that they want third parties to administer this so that they can keep quote unquote costs down. We can't be mad for decisions that the citizenry has made, right? We just can't. They've made the decision. It is what it is. And so now we have to decide as a collective body and a profession, how do we respond from that to that standpoint? And again, I would say that understand that we have a profession where we are wildly fulfilled in terms of what it is that we do. There's some things we don't like about it, but ultimately the physician-patient relationship is what is a fulfilling type of thing. If you have an expectation that you're supposed to control everything that happens, even outside of that relationship, you're going to be sorely disappointed unless you're going cash. And so it's just a little bit of a reframing that ultimately has to happen. And we are not taught in medical school, in college, unless maybe you're a philosophy major, in high school, elementary school, from a personal development standpoint, we don't have the tools in many times of how to reframe that, how to go about kind of reorganizing in our own brain, not what society values as important, but ultimately what we value is ultimately important in our different relationships, whether it's professional, personal, things of that nature. And, personal development really helps you get in tune with really who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. Now, doesn't mean what you're supposed to be doing has to be your profession. You can be a hobby. It can be what you do in terms of your spare time, in terms of your philanthropic time and money and energy. That's up to you. But actually having the skill set to go through and do that type of life inventory and understand where your value as a human being comes from, it was easy for us to be esteemed 50 years ago just because of who we were with our degree. That is no longer the case. And so if an external validation esteem is needed, it's not going to be necessarily through medicine anymore. It may be through the philanthropic side of things. Who knows? And I would argue even further than that. External validation will always keep you running on a treadmill anyway. Validation almost always needs to come from internal. And be clear, we're in the top 1% of all population in terms of education. So none of us can say that we don't have laurels that we can point back to and validate ourselves because we've gotten to this point already. We don't need the external validation because each of us walked this path that 99% of the population could never walk. And so I would argue that that's more than enough to point back at, to say, clearly I am worthy of this and so much more. So.
Sure. Well, Kevin, did you have something?
Oh, well, a couple of things. There's so much we could expound upon there, but I want to go back because we're thinking about the audience here. And we know what, when you're saying personal development, we understand what that means. But if somebody is sort of jumping into this, like I kind of go back to myself 15 years ago, probably around 15 years. And like personal development, I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? Are me talking weight lifting? Am I going to, is that personal development? I got to get my muscles up here. So when we're talking personal development, what does that mean? Or at least, so I'd like to know, what does that mean to you? How would you define it to someone who's unfamiliar with the concept or term? And then secondly is then how did you learn about it? And what put you on this path?
Yeah.
So interestingly enough, so I'd have to pull a dictionary to figure out what kind of personal development is from a textbook standpoint, but just kind of what I was saying earlier in terms of really the exploration of kind of who you are and kind of what your life purpose is, right? Independent of what you've been taught, independent of the boxes people have put you in, independent of your gender, independent of your race, independent of your religion. Like if you go into that quiet place of yourself, which most people have never do, what is it that speaks to you? Even now, be clear, when you were a child, it was there. You either ignored it, you pushed it to the side, you did something else, but it was always there. There was always something that pulled to you, right? And it may not make any money, it may, right? But there is something there. There's a reason why you're on the planet. And most of the time it's usually around helping and serving other people. That's kind of humans' kind of natural hardwiring. And whether that's in medicine, because medicine could be a shadow career for what you really should be doing, right? And that gets into a whole Stephen Pressfield and Do the Work and the War of Art, and where he really talks about kind of these shadow careers. And that's a very interesting book, and I'm gonna have to pull the author to make sure you can put it in the notes, because it's a great kind of series that he talks about from there. But medicine might be a shadow career for some of you who want to change the world, who want to help people in a certain way, and this was the way that you figured out you could do that. But there may be other ways that are calling you as well. And so it's really this personal development is really the exploration of the self, but not in a selfish way, in a selfless way, in terms of what you're here to do kind of for others, right? And then I was introduced to it, interestingly enough, in the investment world, right? So what you will find is that when you get around very wealthy people, they have, outside of Wall Street, but you know, when wealthy people get together, they talk about very different things than middle class and working day people. They talk about significance. They talk about kind of how did they create a mindset that allowed them to take the risk to get to where they were, right? And there's hundreds of years of history of this stuff. And well, I'll circle back. So I go to investment seminars, getting around people, and there's a mentor group that I got in with that the guy who was ahead of it used to tape Brian Tracy and some other guys. He used to do the audio for them. So he incorporated into his seminars personal development. And through them and through other people, then we were able to get back through to Napoleon Hill with which one? What is Napoleon Hill's?
Think and Grow Rich.
Yep, thank you. Think and Grow Rich, which I try to read at least once a year. And so there's a through line, right? From Zig Ziglar to Brian Tracy to Dennis Waitley to Tony Robbins. Like Tony Robbins would be the guy that in the popular press, everybody can look at and say, oh, that's a personal development, quote unquote, guru. But go to Netflix and watch his Netflix, I'm Not Your Guru. And you'll then understand what personal development ultimately is from behind the scenes, right? Because there's all that flash. You think people, Stuart Smiley from SNL, I'm good enough, I'm great enough, and God darns people like me. Essentially, that's the caricature version of personal development. But that's really what it boils down to, is how do you find that spark of who you are, independent of what everybody else has told you you should be, or professionally you've wrapped yourself in.
And I think you kind of touched on it, is I think people they think they understand very superficially, and they're turned off because maybe they watch the infomercials or whatever. And rather than, we have this kind of view, oh, if you see it on the infomercial, it must be bad. Well, actually, you don't know. We really don't know. It's just a sales technique. But they assume that personal development means you're, a snake oil salesman, you're some slimy dude, maybe, something that used car salesman or whatever. But it is so profound. And I guess I wish there was a way, and hopefully through this episode, we're doing that, where you can kind of push through those barriers, because there simply isn't anything that I can see that is as fundamentally important as developing the self. Now, it sounds stupid. But we've stopped for some reason, and maybe this has to do with education, as we go through our educational career and we get through high school or whatever, and there's all this external stuff saying, sign this line, dot this, whatever. And we lose the thought of independent learning and independent learning about us. Like, what is the joy of learning? And without having explored who you are and what you want to do and what's important to you, someone else is going to tell you. And I think that wraps it in a little bit more to our discussion here. So if you were starting this journey, or if you were just starting, or maybe you were the mentor that you had, where would you recommend to the new person, say, hey, I think I want to learn a little bit more about this? Where would I start to explore, and how would I start actually delving into this idea of personal development?
So a lot of it will depend on, are they kind of audio visual people? Do they do better in a seminar format? Like a lot of it will depend on how they receive information, right? The other issue would be, is there something specifically they're trying to learn how to do, right? Because a lot of the seminars where you're trying to go learn a skill of some kind, a lot of those people actually weave a lot of personal development in some of those things, right? You know, if you want to start at the basics, you go back to this personal development Bible, which is essentially Think and Grow Rich, right? That's your first on-ramp into it I would say for most people, is understanding that book. And I tell people, you need to read the book 7 times, right? Once you read the book 7 times, you'll finally get it. Like, oh, this is what he's saying, right? And then read it once a year after that, because as you get deeper and more personal in terms of as you move through the world, things are going to hit you very differently. Information is going to hit you very differently from that standpoint. And so, you know, I would start there. And then if you're talking about just purely, you know, easy access, would probably be YouTube. Most of the personal development people have uploaded a lot of their stuff to YouTube. Mm-hmm. And so you just have to find somebody that makes sense, that whose voice resonates with you, because ultimately there's really kind of one truth, and people just say it differently, and different packages wrap and land on different people differently, if that makes sense. And so kind of once you start down the personal development rabbit hole, you can figure out the people who really resonate with you in terms of their metaphors, the way they storytell or not storytell or what have you, because most of the time the sermon, if you will, is going to be ultimately the same when you really break down to it. And so Napoleon Hill kind of gives you the baseline. Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. That's kind of what was rated the most influential business book of the 20th century, but it really is a personal development book, right? And it teaches you in 7 principles kind of how to view the world from outside of yourself, right? We tend to have as human beings, tend to have a very self-centered outlook on the world. And that was the first book I ever read that really decentered because I read that book before I went to sales training. Sales training completely decenters you from the world, because it makes you think about what the other person may want or what the other person is looking for. And we realize very quickly that you are not necessarily your target customer, even if you're not selling something to somebody. It can be a spouse, it can be a business partner, it can be whatever the case may be, to look at it and to look at the world differently. But 7 Habits of Highly Effective People will give you the tool set to really reorder and be able to control your emotions, right? The thing that Dr. Covey talks about that's so important to me is the stimulus and response gap, right? Ultimately, we may not be able to control what happens to us, but we can absolutely control our response, right? And that no one can make us feel any kind of way if they don't physically do anything to us and touch us, right? And so the regulation of emotions is a big personal development thing, right? Not everything that happens around you is directed at you. Most people aren't even thinking about you, right? Most people may offend you by accident. They're just not thinking about you. And you don't have to be upset at other people's problems necessarily, or you don't need to be more upset than other people are the things that actually have happened to them, right? The letting the outside world regulate your emotions. And that takes us back to what we were talking about, right? The frustration, the burnout, because we're letting the outside kind of healthcare system, quote unquote, affect our internal emotions, right? As opposed to, hey, I'm here to treat these patients. This is what I'm going to do, right? And this system around here might make that a little bit more difficult than I think it needs to be, but I'm here to do this, right? And this is what I'm here for. These are the things and the people that I'm here for, right? And so that regulation of emotion is what our society needs so much, because we've equated feelings with truth. Feelings are not truth.
Yeah, that's so true. And, you know, just to jump off of that is, you talked about, you know, that much of the middle class or low to middle class don't maybe spend the time to think about meaning. They're in that survivor mode. That's kind of how I like to phrase it. And their bandwidth for, I mean, just just trying to survive in society of the stress and working full-time jobs, or both parents working full-time jobs and having multiple kids, and like they never can slow down. You talked about people just don't slow down to like listen to themselves in some way and try to figure out maybe what they're really made of and what their purpose is in this world. I think of how many physicians are in this place of survivor kind of mode, and I feel like, and I'm curious if you feel the same way, is that, and I think it aligns with your story from, and everyone should go back and watch the other episodes, of course, Dr. Tait, at least the very first one, just to hear his story. But I would suspect that in order to extricate yourself from that day in, day out hustle, and to open the space for that personal development, you have to find ways to free up your time, whether that's taking a day off during the week or something like that. What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I'm going to ask is do a time diary, because, we all have one of these. I'm holding up a phone, which you may not be able to see with my background, right? Count how many hours you spend on Facebook and on Instagram and all of this and Netflix, right? And even, and this is kind of, I don't think most people examine their life, right? I don't think most people do it. And that cuts across a lot of income levels. I would think that the very wealthy are the ones who do it more, but I don't think most people examine their lives from that standpoint, right? So it's not it's just a societal thing, right? No, that kind of introspection, because we have a consumer-based society, right? 70% of our economy runs on consumerism, right? And when you do that type of introspection work, the material doesn't matter as much anymore, right? The things don't matter as much anymore, right? And so with my story, because the things didn't matter more than my time, I just took a pay cut. Like, I'm working 4 days a week. Don't pay me less. Now, it just so happened I was spending that extra time on the personal development and in the investing, so I made the money up from the investment side. So my labor was not required to do that anymore. But that treadmill and hamster wheel, especially on the physician side, right? We oftentimes lock ourselves in a box of materialism. Well, we make good salaries, right? Even with all the debt many people might have, that debt can still be paid off, right? And so you've got to be mindful of the material box you put yourself in terms of where you're living, where you're sending your kids to school, all these kinds of things. Because the material is what takes the attention, right? The introspection, you need less material, because you're just doing different kinds of things. You're with people, you're with friends. The experiences begin to take over at that point, right? And so really it's a reframing of, why am I on this treadmill? Why we're all working and doing all of this? Why are we working so hard to do what? To what end? Why is it that if we, it's from an investment standpoint, my mantra is always decouple labor from your lifestyle. Like, are you working every day just to maintain your things, right? I always argue that your investments should maintain your things, so you can work less and do whatever you want. And some of that, I would argue, is personal development, right? And I always, on the Physicians Road platform, we always start with personal development, because until you change your mindset, your actions won't change. And that's why you have to examine, what it is am I doing in life? Like, what is the point of this?
Yeah.
The age of question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that was it.
No, I'm wondering, but that moment where you're doing the introspection, did you personally, or do you find people have trouble being quiet with themselves? Like this sense of needing to, like there's that, like, you don't know where to go with that. You sit there with yourself and you're trying to ask yourself questions, but sometimes it's just uncomfortable, or you feel so pulled to get things done, or, fill the time with doing.
Yeah. So I've been lucky, right? Because I went down this personal development pathway. I went through some amazing kind of trainings and kind of goal setting seminars where you went through and ripped out all the BS of your life, and you distilled stuff down to what, like, you've got you like, write out your perfect day. What does a perfect day look like? From sun up to sundown, write it down, right? You've got 3 months to live to live. write your own obituary, right? You've got 3 days to live. Who are you seeing and why? Right. And so I would go through seminars, 3-day seminars where we would have to do all of these kinds of crazy exercises. Right.
Wow.
So I got super clear, relatively young, like, oh, I ripped out all this nonsense. Like, I don't care about that. 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 Right. But that not being able to be in a quiet space, that's why therapy was created. Right. That's why, like all of this, people don't realize that therapy is personal development. Right. But you've got to figure out if you're doing kind of growth work or you're doing healing work. Right. There's some things you have to heal from, or you're growing into another person. And sometimes you have to do both. Right. I'd argue heal first, get back to baseline, and then grow from there. Right. Because you can try to grow, but if your foundation is crappy, not going to go. So for those who can't be alone, can't be by themselves, can't be in their own head, you ask the question, why is that? Right.
Yeah.
Why is that? That may require some therapy. That may require other kinds of things. But the subconscious and the unconscious always manifest consciously. We're all physicians. We all see it. It happens with our patients all the time, right? And so I always tell my patients, listen, you have to deal with this because this is why it's manifested. This is why your diabetes, this is why your anxiety is this is why is this. So let's go back to this trauma you had here. What do we want to do about this? Because none of this is going to, you're overweight. That's from this back here, right? People don't realize 70-80% of primary care is just psychology and psychiatry and all of this social stuff, right? The medicine is 20%. The rest is just being in people's heads to figure out why they're making bad decisions. What bad pathological loop are they in to end up where they ultimately are, right? That's all of us, right? How do we undo whatever loops we may be in that don't allow us to be able to sit with ourselves and do healthy things that aren't detrimental?
That's a whole nother episode right there.
Oh, that is,
Yep.
yeah,
Absolutely. But it all ties together.
It does. And I think so often that gets forgotten. And I think as physicians, and this brings it back again to this whole personal development thing, is because if you're treading water out there, and particularly if you're in a busy practice, and I'm thinking primary care, but there's many specialists that are going to see this exact same thing, rheumatology being a big one, endocrinology being another big one. But the more you explore your personal development, the more you're going to understand, or at least appreciate, the perspectives of the patients that are coming into your practice. And that becomes so important because we're like, oh, I have this patient with diabetes and they're completely non-compliant, blah, 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 blah. They're not doing this. And well, why are they non-compliant? What is the factors in their life? Obesity being a big one. And you talk about obesity, and I don't think it's as prominent now, but with the original ACEs study come out when we were looking at childhood trauma, that came out of studying people that were obese, where they realized that people with morbid obesity, and obviously this was back in the 80s and 90s, that a huge percentage of them had been abused as child, particularly sexual abuse. So I guess I just love what you're saying, because the more I think as physicians we learn this, and the more we realize that actually if you take a moment to learn about yourself, you're going to understand those around you a little bit better as well. And I can't think of any profession that's as important as doing that as being a physician, because that's basically what we do, is these interpersonal, intimate relationships that we have with people. But
that's the privileged position that we sit in, right? It's us in the priesthood, right? Where people will bare their bodies and their souls to us if we do it right. That's what I say. That's why, irrespective of what the system is doing, that interpersonal connection with the patients hasn't changed. No matter how much we're vilified in the public press, we're not vilified by the patients who are sitting in front of us, right? We're like congressmen, right? And Congress people. Everybody hates everybody else's congressperson, but they love their own. Right. So, and sometimes we might lose sight of that because we're taking in the external noise of society and the loss of esteem based upon our predecessors. But a lot of times that esteem is not lost by the people in front of us. Now, ER, a little different. Pain, drug seekers, maybe a little different. But for the most part, 80+, 90+% of our patients are appreciative of what we do. Right. Yeah. And what other profession can people say that?
Yeah.
right? And that's what I mean by the reshifting and reframing of what it is that we do. The problem is, a lot of times we just have to take money out of this, right? Because a lot of this is really around money, right? That we're working harder than we should be for what we're getting paid,
For
right?
what we think we should be getting paid, or
Exactly.
we think we're working
Exactly.
harder for what we're getting paid. You know, that was, you know, not to change the conversation too much, but I was thinking about this earlier today, is physician incomes, we all feel underpaid, but the amount that we're actually reimbursed is pretty astronomical. I mean, I was thinking it from the standpoint of the 4% rule, right? Well, what's the rule for retirement? Well, it's 4% of your portfolio. Well, I'm like, well, let's look at it from your daily income. If you are making $250,000 a year, which is pretty standard for a primary care doc in many ways, and in many of the physicians, no, that's like a $5 million portfolio, basically generating those returns. So you're a $5 million asset at least that's producing this stuff. And I think sometimes we need to step back as physicians and just be able to recognize what a privilege is that we have. And the other thing that you said really early on is the risk of unemployment. That, you know, unless you're a crook or a hack or cause criminal harm, you're going to have a job. Right? And yeah, anyway, we are remarkably privileged, and I think it's good to, again, I think that personal development standpoint allows us to step back and actually be appreciative of what we have, rather than to focus on the perceived lack of what we want.
And here's the thing: it's not lack; it's comparison. The thing in our society, because everybody has, even our poorest people are richer than 80% of the people on the planet, right? What we do is we compare ourselves to Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and what those people have, right? What personal development does is it teaches you to run your own race. You are put here to do something else, maybe not that, right? And the comparison is what kills people. The comparison, and I don't want to call it envy, but it's the comparison that kills us from that standpoint. If we're not comparing ourselves to other people, we're doing pretty well as a profession. We're like, we're doing pretty well, right?
Yeah, more psychology. I mean,
that's all it is. That's all human interactions are.
Yeah, and like you said, and I definitely we want to respect your time. I mean, I think the personal development as individuals and in interaction with patients, you're going to be better at supporting their own personal development as well, which was kind of alluded to with what you said, Kevin. But in the end, with the crazy society and what's going on in this world right now, and the amount of tension and stress and lack of insight, and the more people we can have having some personal development is only going to better, you know, our society. Of course, that's going to take some time, and there'll never be 100% involvement there. But I think, you know, our patients are better served by us being more personally developed as physicians. So their overall wellness, and obviously, which is being supported by their actions and their thoughts and the traumas that are unresolved. I mean, it's all connected. And I think we could say we're being holistic on this podcast, that all of these things are important, and they are definitely have relationships with one another. So
absolutely. I would say, because here's the thing: no action happens without thought. No deliberate action, right? Clearly our hearts beat without necessarily conscious thought, right? But no deliberate actions happen without thought. And people seem to forget something, you know, an idea doesn't have to be true to be detrimental, right? There are lots of false ideas running around that are detrimental, right? People are thinking things are just flat out wrong. Yeah. And their life can spin out from it. Even if they don't realize it's not wrong, they make actions based upon what they've been told and what they think. And it leads to ultimately bad outcomes, right? And so ideas are powerful. Nothing changes without an idea. Yeah. And what personal development does is it trains your mind to give you ideas that feed you and aren't detrimental to what you ultimately want to get out of life and what your fulfillment and your purpose is.
Right. As long as it's benevolent.
Well, some people have malevolent. That's their malevolent kind of thing, right? And society will deal with that, right? Yeah. You know, I try to keep it as judgment free as possible.
Let's hope it's benevolent. How about that?
Exactly. We can hope it's benevolent, but you know, they may have a perspective, right? Sure. And so, but you know, I'm a libertarian, so I believe, you know, no coercion, no harm. So that's always the first rule.
Right.
But that returns to the point, though. Again, the more you learn about yourself, why you do what you do, your past and how it influences your current present, as well as your perspectives of what the future is going to be. The more you delve into that, and the more you learn what you touched on earlier on about your emotions, that's a whole nother episode there. And this idea people think that emotions are this thing that just pulls you around and they're uncontrollable. All is BS. And it made me think, and I don't want to, again, respecting your time here, but a lot of this comes down to, if we're looking from the ocean standpoint, is if you aren't taking the time to at least to start to master your own emotions, or at least to understand the fundamentals behind it, someone else is gonna. And we see that with the way that the algorithms work, that the draws to attention are. You touched on it with this idea about beliefs and how that drives these ideology, and how people whipsaw back and forth, are not thinking clearly anymore. So it really behooves us all, again, to return back to this point of just take the time to learn about yourself, learn about where you came from, learn about, how your brain and body does the stuff that does, because I guarantee that there's people who know it and they're going to use it to control you, or at least to gain a semblance of control. I don't know. And for me, I hate being controlled.
Yep.
I hate that idea.
No one can make you feel anything. Only you and your response to something is how emotions are felt.
Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I'm gonna. Do you have anything else there, Melissa?
Go ahead.
We're gonna talk for like 2 hours here, and this
Take us out, Kevin.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on the Change Physician podcast today with our fabulous guest, who always love having you, Eric. We're going to have to figure another one to come back on, because we had like 3 episodes right here. I'm like, we got to talk about that. We got to talk about that.
I'm always happy to come back.
But if you enjoyed this episode, we appreciate the rating or review, whether you're seeing us on YouTube or on any of your audio podcast networks. You can go to the community at thechangephysician.com, join us there. And until next time, stay well.
Take care.